I've smoked a ton of briskets, even though I've only been barbecuing for a year.
Wow.
Which makes me the most qualified teacher because I can understand your questions when it comes to brisket, and at the same time, I've learned a ton of tricks for professional pitmasters. It's sort of like a cartoon I used to watch as a kid called Rugrats. There was a character on the show named Angelica who was a toddler, so she could speak baby language with Tommy and his friends, but at the same time, she could communicate with the adults on the show. So think of me as Angelica teaching you barbecue babies some handy brisket tricks translated straight from the barbecue grown-ups. Actually, Angelica was pretty mean to the babies, and I would never hurt you guys. Just kidding.
You do a Mortal Kombat fatality on him?
Okay, well, if that analogy didn't make any sense to you, then hopefully this picture can help. So the big minion is me, you're the crying Vegeta, and the baby minion is your little brisket waiting to be smoked to near perfection.
So believe it or not, the first common beginner brisket mistake comes before you even get the brisket out of the package. Because when you first get into barbecue, you have no idea what the meat market is like. So you hear Jeremy Yoder or Bradley Robinson tell you to check out Porter Road or Snake River Farms, and then you end up buying a brisket from there. This is a huge mistake, and this is not a knock on Porter Roads or Snake River Farms. I hear that they have really good briskets. But you're a beginner, so you're more than likely going to mess something up in your first few brisket cooks. So instead, get some meat that is good quality, but is also on the cheaper end of the spectrum. And with those parameters, my brisket buying tier list is Costco, Sam's Club, and then Walmart. Pound for pound, Costco or Sam's Club is the best deal because you get prime grade brisket for a price point that's about the same, if not cheaper, than you can get choice grade at the grocery store. But in general, regardless of whatever store you go to, I recommend buying your briskets at $3 to $4.50 a pound. And pro tip, you can freeze briskets for up to 6 months. So when the price point gets to around $3, I like to buy them in bulk and just freeze them for later. Okay, and with that covered, let's go ahead and open up this brisket and talk about the trim. So this is one of the most important parts of the entire brisket cooking process. Meaning if you mess up here in the wrong ways, your final product is absolutely doomed. So the whole point of trimming the brisket in the beginning is so that when we're done cooking, the entire brisket is edible. Because if we need additional trimming to our brisket at the end of the cook, we're basically removing that beautiful crust we just spent 20 hours developing. So let's go ahead and start this trim on the fat cap side of the brisket. So for beginners, I say you should cut off the mohawk, which is this big hunk of fattened meat on the point end of the brisket. You want this brisket to be as even as possible because that way it will cook as evenly as possible. And another reason to remove the mohawk is because we need to access the decal fat that's right under it, so this fat will not completely render once the brisket is done. So if you don't cut it out, you're gonna end up with this big glob of white fat and no one's gonna eat it. So just carve out as much of it as you can, but at the same time, make sure it's not too caved in. We want the surface to be smooth so it can cook evenly. The next thing we're gonna do is even out all the fat on the fat cap down to 1/4 of an inch. And this is crucial because if the fat cap is too fatty, then you're gonna have a lot of trouble rendering the fat on the fat cap. So in order to pull this off, you need to look at the fat in 2 separate sections. The top half being the point and the bottom half being the flat. For the flat, you wanna cut the fat going down the brisket long ways. This is because the fat is uneven across the brisket. So if you do go across the brisket, you're gonna have a much greater chance of accidentally cutting into the meat. For the point, I like to cut it from the center of the brisket down to the edge of the cutting board. And just keep going down until the fat is even with the mohawk we trimmed earlier. And as you're trimming, it's a good idea to make small incisions in your brisket to see where the fat line is so you can ensure that you're hitting that 1/4 inch that we're looking for. So during this process, as a beginner, you're going to scalp your brisket, which is basically cutting too deep and leaving red patches on the fat cap. But this is honestly not a big deal because these red spots are going to pool liquid on your brisket and that can totally ruin your bark. But there's an easy solution. You just have to lift up your brisket and tip out the liquid as you cook. And plus, if you're cooking fat side down, these patches aren't even gonna make a difference at the end. Next, we're gonna shape the brisket by cutting off the gray meat from the side and rounding it out at the flat. Because we do not want any parts of the brisket sticking out while we're cooking because they will burn. Now on to the lean side. So we're gonna take this big hunk of decal fat on the top and completely carve it out. Because like I said before, the decal fat is not good eats. So just use the knife and slowly peel away at the hunk of hard fat until you get it completely out. I like using a boning knife to trim brisket specifically for this part, but whatever knife you use, make sure it's super sharp. And I don't care too much about the silver skin, which is this webby white connective tissue that's on the lean side of the brisket, because I cook my briskets lean side down on the cooking grate, so I think it just flakes away or something, because at the end of the cook when I'm ready to cut and serve, I never notice any silver skin. But if you do want to cut it off, make sure to lift the brisket with your offhand while you trim, because it will make it much easier. So now for seasoning. So I love Derby style, which is kosher salt, pepper, and then Lowry seasoning. It's a great rub combo and it tastes amazing on pretty much any meat you want to barbecue. But use whatever seasoning you like, but be mindful of what's in your rub, because if there's already salt in your rub, you're gonna want to take it easy on the kosher salt. Because although brisket is a massive piece of meat, it is possible to oversalt it. Trust me, I know from experience. But if you're doing salt, pepper, Lowry's like me, then I will show you exactly how I do it. So when applying the seasoning, I like to lift up my container like 1.5 feet above the meat, so that I have control on not only how much seasoning to put on it, but also so that it gets an even coat all over it. So at the same time while I'm seasoning my brisket, I'm also seasoning the big piece I trimmed off from the flat and also the mohawk we trimmed off, because we are going to make use of these pieces right away. But before we do, let's go ahead and get the smoker fired up.
So I have experience with pellet grills, Weber kettles, Weber Smoky Mountains, and offsets, and each one of these cookers cooks brisket at a different temperature. So I will post them on the screen right now so you can take a screenshot or pause the video if you need them. And we're gonna hold steady at these temperatures for the whole time until it's time to wrap. As you may have noticed, I did not put cooking temps for ceramic grills because I do not have experience with ceramic grills, nor do I own one. But for your reference, I have a link to Smoking Dad BBQ's YouTube channel in the description below, because he's the master of Kamado grills and he can answer any question you might have about that cooker. And for a beginner brisket, I will say that cooking temp is one of the most important factors while cooking a brisket. So with the pit up to temp and the brisket on, we're going to talk about a major mistake that beginners make, which is spraying the brisket too early. Generally speaking, for the first 3.5 to 5 hours, you are not going to spritz your brisket at all. Heck, you probably don't even need to open up the cook chamber to check on the meat if you're running the pit steady. Do not spray just because it looks dry. Drying out the surface of the meat is a part of the process of building the bark, which is called the Maillard reaction. So if you spritz too often or too early, then this process never has a chance to start and you end up with a brisket with no bark. The spritz is solely used to cool down the hotter parts of the brisket so that the whole thing can cook evenly. It's the same thing that happens when your body sweats. The sweat on your face and your body evaporate and it cools you down. And use whatever spritz you like, water, juice, apple cider vinegar, beer, it really doesn't matter. So the brisket has been on for a few hours and now we need to talk about those trimmings that I seasoned and put to the side. So since we started, I had these trimmings cooking next to the brisket. And since they came from the Big Papa brisket, I call them Brisket Juniors. So the Brisket Juniors only take a few hours to finish, and these delicious snacks help us avoid a common brisket mistake. So cooking brisket takes anywhere between 10 to 20 hours depending on your rest time. And while you're smelling these delicious meat vapors in the air, every second that passes by is a temptation to rush the process so you can sink your teeth into some succulent brisket. But by making a Brisket Junior, you're able to kill your craving and take your time so that you can give your brisket the care and nurture it so desperately needs. Because like Chuck from Goldie's Barbecue says, these briskets is our sons. So then these Brisket Juniors is ours grandsons? What? And another common brisket mistake is timing your cook based on the weight of the brisket. So when I cooked my first brisket, I learned from Google that you cook brisket 1 hour for every pound it weighs. But this is problematic because we trimmed off a whole bunch of stuff in the trimming process and I have no idea how much it weighs now. On top of that, this information is more like a data point for brisket trend analysis versus a practical trick that you can use while you're in the trenches of cooking, because the thickness, the length, and other factors are all different for each brisket you cook. So here are some clutch warning signs that you can look out for while you're smoking your brisket. So if your brisket is starting to curl, puff up, get crunchy on the sides or the bottom, then you need to lower the pit temperatures because you are in danger of burning your brisket. On the opposite spectrum, if you've been cooking for 5+ hours and the bark still hasn't set, then you're likely cooking too low. However, cooking too low isn't gonna ruin your brisket. You are wasting fuel and time, so you could be cooking a lot quicker and hotter if you run into this problem. Okay, so we are about 7 hours into the cook and we need to talk about wrapping the brisket. So the point of wrapping the brisket is solely for efficiency. It helps you speed up your cook so your brisket can finish faster, and it also pushes you past the stall, which is the point in which the moisture from the brisket is evaporating and cooling the brisket at a rate that is almost equal to the amount of heat the meat is absorbing. And this happens at around the 165 degrees Fahrenheit mark. However, do not wrap your brisket unless you see these signs. Use your fingernail to tap and scratch the bark, and if it doesn't come off, then the first parameter is met. Next, poke the fat on the top of the brisket. Now, you want this fat to be completely rendered, so your finger should sink in pretty easily. However, this test only applies if you're cooking fat side up, because if you followed my trim instructions and carved out that decal fat, there shouldn't be any fat on the lean side of the brisket. Finally, temp the center of the brisket, and if it reads less than 160 degrees Fahrenheit, then do not wrap. The brisket most likely has too much water in it. So if you wrap before 160 at the lowest, then all that water is gonna release inside of the wrap, and that will wash off your bark. So now that we have seen all the signs, it is time to wrap, and we are approaching the most controversial topic of this video. Should we wrap with butcher paper or foil? So my answer to this age-old question is, it doesn't matter. But if you are a beginner, I would say to use butcher paper. But if you're gonna use foil, I highly recommend that you push past the stall to the high 170s before you wrap. Because foil is non-porous, so it's gonna collect all of the moisture that the meat sweats out, and it's gonna wash off your bark if you wrap too early. If you're using butcher paper, it's a lot more forgiving in this area because it is porous, so it's not gonna completely seal in the moisture that sweats out. And also, butcher paper allows us to do our next beginner trick, which is a beef tallow wrap. So while the meat is cooking, put your trimmings in a foil pan inside your cooker to melt down the fat into tallow. Then pour it onto the butcher paper when you're ready to wrap. Then place the brisket lean side down into the tallow and then wrap it up. And I recommend putting the wrapped brisket back in the cooker fat side up because the wrap will pull more tallow at the bottom of the wrap, keeping the lean nice and juicy. This is a great trick for beginners because if your brisket is a little bit dry, the tallow can help cover that up. But if you're using foil, I'd highly recommend that you just skip the tallow altogether because again, you don't want to add liquid to the wrap because it might affect your bark. But I've actually never tried foil wrapping with beef tallow before, so I can't say for certain. So now that the brisket is back on the pit, the question we need to answer is when is it ready to pull? Well, here's a trick I learned from Texicana Barbecue. Just put your hands under the brisket and push your fingers right in the middle where the point and the flat meets. If you can feel the meat give, then that means that the connective tissue between the point and the flat has completely broken down, which means it's ready to pull. And if it still feels tight, then keep cooking. And just FYI, the breakdown of this connective tissue can happen anywhere between 190 degrees Fahrenheit all the way to 215 degrees Fahrenheit. So the brisket is finally finished, and I know you can't wait to just unwrap this thing and devour it, but that would be a huge mistake. One of the most crucial stages of the brisket cook is the rest. And from my experience, a long rest time can ensure that all the fat inside of the brisket is completely rendered because beef fat renders at 130 degrees Fahrenheit to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can rest your brisket in a cooler with some towels to fill the dead space, or you can just put it in your oven at the lowest setting. All right, so with the brisket rested and unwrapped, we are so close to enjoying the fruits of our labor. But do not trip yourself up before we made it to the finish line. Before you cut into the brisket, make sure to look at the lean side, and you want to look to see where the grains of the meat are because you want to cut against it. And if you follow all these tips, then you should have a brisket that looks very similar to the one that I have here. Or will it? I gotta come clean. Your brisket is gonna be amazing, but there's no way that the bark is gonna be nearly as dark as the one I have here. So make sure to watch the video on your screen right now where I slice into this brisket and I show you step by step how I got the bark this incredibly dark.